Today on the Work Sucks But I Like It podcast, we sit down with Professor David Shar to rethink everything we think we know about burnout. As he puts it, in order to burn out, we need to be on fire first. This episode isn't just about working too hard, it's about what happens when we are losing our identity, about how work in America often defines our value, and why a term he loves to use, passion decline, goes deeper than just hours on the clock. David challenges the classic question, what do you do? And flips it on its head. It's not what you do, it's who you do it for. I love that. He also reminds us that while titles may hold weight in the room, outside the room, people are going to do what they want. So we need to approach burnout from a whole new perspective. Let's roll right in.
The people who lose passion for work, um, every one of these people I spoke to, the way they talked about work is the way I talk about my wife on a good day, right? I mean, like they talked about it like it was a love of theirs. And they talked about this like it was a love that they went through this horrible breakup with. And they gave everything for, and if somebody would have just said pause, that would have been incredibly helpful.
All right, welcome to the Work Sucks But I Like It podcast show. Today we've got Professor David Shar from the University of Maryland. He teaches courses on industrial organizational psychology, and he founded the Illuminate Performance Management Consultants, where he's a consultant, keynote speaker, and corporate trainer since 2019. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here, and also an honor. I'm looking over your bio, and I know your listeners have your bio, but what that look, you are a modern day Renaissance man. Everything from yoga to metallurgy to industrial organizational psychology. Really impressive.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, David. Appreciate it. So I really want to start with your dissertation. So it said, you're losing passion for work. Can you walk us through how you got to that point where you wanted to do your PhD for that? I think that's a great topic for us to start with.
Yeah, as you know, as a current PhD candidate, right? Like it's a really hard thing to find what your topic is gonna be, and everybody tells you the number one advice is, "You can't solve all the problems in the world. This is one study, like, just get it done." But it's hard to actually do that, and I really needed something that spoke to me and something that I felt was really relevant to the moment. Um, but my PhD journey was a long one, and it went all the way through 2020, the pandemic and the Great Resignation and quiet quitting. And so following this journey, in the beginning, I've always been interested in burnout, but I started, and that was my original, I do a ton of work with burnout and burnout prevention with organizations. And like that was originally the topic for my dissertation, but I noticed something bigger happening. I guess it was in about 2020, 2021, like right post pandemic, where you're familiar with the website reddit.com, right? These message boards r slash like the subreddit r slash anti work quickly became the fastest growing subreddit. So the fastest growing discussion board on Reddit, which is I believe already the largest discussion board type of thing on the internet, anti-work started outpacing everything else in terms of its growth. And I got really sucked into that and seeing what people were saying about work and seeing in my professional capacity as I'm walking in and talking to employers and they're saying nobody wants to work anymore. And I'm talking to employees and they're saying nobody sees us. Like I would just want to be seen. I want to have an impact. And so there was this massive disconnect. And I felt like it had started going beyond burnout. And in my study, somebody one of my participants described how they had burned out on almost a yearly basis. They were a teacher, a day school teacher, and they had burned out again and again almost every year. But by the time summer rolled around, they were energized, ready to go again until they stopped being re-energized and started like really falling into something a lot more serious than burnout. And that was literally falling out of love for the work that they had dedicated their life to. And so that's how I came across passion decline because I had experienced the good side, the passion for work, and I'm a huge believer in work, which is why your podcast title stood out. I'm yelling at my monitor, "No, it doesn't have to suck. It doesn't have to." And so following this journey, I followed this journey with 8 specific individuals. What it looked like to have this passion, this love integrated into their identity for the work that they did, and to see that dissipate over time until they all crossed this sort of like this point where there was no return.
So that was your study. You followed 8 people and
Yes.
watched them decline, if you will, with their engagement to work?
Yeah, it was a
Oh,
phenomenological
super
study, so
interesting.
endless conversations with these individuals, really following that journey from the beginning, and seeing all this energy and passion for their work in the beginning, and seeing what they talked about and what drew them to their work. And then, many of the interviews, went through this period of just, tears and sometimes anger and frustration, and they got really it was like from one emotion to the next, and this was just them, reflecting on their experience, and, very, very powerful.
So, David, can you walk us through here, for the audience here, differentiating between burnout and when you have those moments where you're just like, you don't want to do anything? Like, what's the difference between burnout and you get to those points with your work, you're like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore?
Yeah. So I think burnout is kind of like it's the gateway. It's sort of like the thing that launches this often, right? You burn out and then you start to really lose your passion for work generally. But burnout typically is this um you know, maybe shorter term kind of thing, right? And sometimes it can last a long time and we continue to call it burnout, but I'd argue that at that point maybe it's passion decline. Right? I mean, some of the earliest authors of, these burnout studies, I believe it was Ayala Pines who said that, in order to burn out, you need to be on fire first, right? And so not everybody, can burn out. A lot of times if you go in and you don't have the expectations, that this work is gonna be meaningful and impactful, and you don't have this connection, then it's kinda hard to burn out, but it's not hard to become disengaged though, right? But burnout is sort of the sensation that, just it's almost like a depression, right? It's like you start to lose sort of this engagement in your work. A lot of early researchers would also say that burnout is the opposite of engagement, right? But passion decline is something so much more fundamental. Passion decline and loss is where this thing used to be part of my identity, and now it's like it's an identity crisis as it's becoming torn from that. Right? So I think that the things that cause burnout and burnout ultimately can bring on this passion decline, but it's also not necessary. It's interesting because burnout oftentimes, and I think wrongly, but burnout is like overwork, right? Too much work equals burnout. And I think that that's such a simplistic way of looking at things. I often tell people, I asked them to think about the last time they were in a bar, like on a busy night, right? Like it's a busy Friday night. They're in a bar in a popular part of town, and look at that bartender and tell me if they look burned out. Most of the time they look quite the opposite. Most of the time they look like they're in a state of flow as their body just takes over, and they'll tell you they feel energized in that moment, right? They're taking a tip over here and they're mixing a drink here and they're taking an order here. Um, but if you take that same bartender and every time they turn around to grab a glass, there isn't one or it's dirty, now you have a bartender who starts to look a little bit more like we expect with burnout, right? So, burnout, I don't think primarily comes from too much work. It's too much standing in the way, the bureaucracy, the conflict, the all of the things that stand in the way of us doing the work that we signed up to do to begin with, right? Um, but when you get to passion decline, it's an intense separation within somebody's identity with their
So
work.
I want to build on that with the identity crisis. So I guess with burnout today, do you see like is the frequency shorter? I guess like I'm thinking like the people's attention spans today. People on their phones are not being able to sit with themselves. Does that factor into this burnout that's I guess I'm seeing it more frequently? Is that a fair statement to say that we're seeing burnout more frequently this day and age than years ago, decades ago?
But yeah, I think we definitely are. So first of all, we know that burnout seems to be contagious, right? Within organizations, but there's also a crossover effect. So when somebody, if you have a spouse or a significant other who you live with, when they have negative experiences at work, they bring that home, and there's this crossover effect. And you then bring that to your personal life. It enters your home, and then you bring it to your employer. And I think social media has exacerbated that. Um, and so a huge element of burnout, our real original sort of understanding, Maslach is like is the original sort of like the mind behind burnout. And she would describe burnout as having it's sort of this tripartite thing, this three legs that it stands on, right? Three major symptoms. And one of those symptoms is um what she originally called depersonalization, but what has been generalized toward general cynicism toward your work, right? And I think if we look around, there's so much cynicism toward work, and that's that anti-work forum, right? I think I used to be an employer and tell everyone that, like, this feels like family, and in interviews say, "We're a family here." And you know what's crazy? Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody said that I was a master manipulator, trying to pull them in. Now, if I even mention, like, work as family, it's like a second family to my students who are industrial organizational psychology master's students, the entire like, you hear the eye roll throughout the room, right? So even the people who are studying the psychology of work feel like this is BS and this is manipulative. There is this real pervasive sense of cynicism, and I might add, well-earned cynicism. Because as employers have become maybe greedier, if you want to label it that way, but certainly where there's been a larger gap growing between the wealthiest and the least wealthy, between the CEO and the average employee, that the cynicism around that is obviously going to start to expand. And everybody who's worked for an employer who said we feel like family and then been laid off, you know, it's kind of like you don't recover from that and say, yeah, it's like a family at your next employer.
Mm. So one of the things I'm really interested in the workplace, and you've mentioned flow, right? So I love studying about flow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's original work, and his book on flow, he talked about this paradox of work, right? Where he did this study, he sampled people in his experiencing sampling method. I forget what it was, ESM. And so anyway, so sampled these people throughout the day at work, and found that people at work found flow states more often than not than people doing leisure activities. But when they were asked what they'd rather be doing, it was outside of work, things outside of work. Why? And he called that the paradox of work because you're in a flow state at work, but when you're outside of work, you're usually not in a flow state, but people would rather be in that. But flow is attributed to happiness and things like that. What are your thoughts on why we compartmentalize work and life today? Why do we separate the two?
That is so interesting. I think that there are real reasons why we separate these things, and I think why people talk about work-life balance, which, by the way, does not work in terms of temporally, right? So work-life balance cannot be equal amount of hours at work, equal amount of hours at home. I don't think anybody wants that or expects that. But quality of time at work and quality of time at home, I think, is important. But sort of like this work life separation instead of integration, I think that comes up when there is not when boundaries start to be crossed where people cannot separate from work, which is important, right? I mean, to psychologically reset outside of work is important. And when employers will be blowing up your phone and there's an expectation to respond to emails, within 20 minutes and you're with your kids or out with your friends, then yeah, then people start saying, okay, we need clear boundaries. And I would suggest to employers and employees that boundaries are important specifically because of that. Some people, their work is what energizes them and they want more integration. And so I think it needs to be like everything, there's nuance, right? And you need to understand the people. But I have this client who was the director of a really huge pseudo government, a government attached organization. And I was working with him post pandemic, probably somewhere around 2021. And the guy gets on the Zoom call with me for our first meeting, and he's laying back. His shirt is wide open. He's got like the least professional kind of face to face I've ever had with a director level, CEO level person. And he's leaning back and he's telling me his story because he wanted me to help with that work life balance. And also, this was like, how can people work from home more if they want? And he started explaining to me that the way he moved up in his organization was he was always going the extra mile, and then he would go out of his way to create this sort of vision that he was, or he would schedule his emails to be sent out in the middle of the night, so it would look like he was working in the middle of the night. And then when he got to the leadership level, he continued to do this to test the loyalty and the work ethic of the people under him to see if they waited until 9 a.m. the next day when they got an email from him at 2 a.m. to respond. And if they did, they had no chance of moving up in the organization. And
Wow.
so he was regretful of that, post
I would
pandemic
hope
because
so.
he had had this transformation. And now he said he doesn't send emails in the middle of the night, and he tells his people that he's not going to read them if they do.
So how do you encourage when you consult with companies and people, how do you get them to see the importance of work and life balance? And I guess to start with that, how do you define work? So kind of two parts to that. I know, right? Very
That's
loaded
a
question.
That's a really interesting question. So, I think work is anything that you're doing for the organization, right? But it does get messy. Like if you're, it's not necessarily FaceTime. It's not necessarily office time. Sometimes it just means being on call, but and that's kind of interesting in its own sense, right? Because being on call, having the work phone or having work, which I actually encourage having a work phone, right? As opposed to work calls coming in on your private cell phone. If you are working, if you are somebody who needs to be on call, because there needs to be times when you turn off your cell phone, right? Um, but yeah, I think that having that separation, but even being on call, even having the cell phone in your pocket, knowing that you could be called at any time, that's working, right? Um, I was talking with this judge. He works for a circuit court as a judge, and they have this sort of system where every weekend and nights, like for a week, you take the weekends and nights where you're on call for if somebody needs a last minute petition or to get a search thing, right? Like any of that sort of stuff, you're on call. So they give you the special cell phone. And this judge was saying the entire week they don't sleep, whether they get calls or not. Right? So, like, there's something where you should be able to unplug. I have a client right now who, has a incredibly demanding job, and he puts everything into it, and he's on almost all the time, but he has 2 hobbies. 1, he's in a band. And so that's like this social outlet because he goes out with his band and plays in a club and whatever. But even more important, maybe, is his hobby. He goes out on a lake. He has a small boat. He goes out on the lake and fishes by himself for hours. Right. And there's something really, really powerful for that, right? Because nobody can reach him when he's out on that lake. And that's by design. I think it's incredibly important. But I don't know what your second part of that question was. Sorry, my
No,
ADHD
it's all
brain
good.
doesn't
I know I'm loading you with a
yeah,
lot of stuff here. So in my mind, I'm like the engineer in me is trying to always solve, I guess, the work-life balance
yeah,
equation. And to
yeah,
me, in order to solve that, we have to understand the variables at play, right? So what is work? What is life? So yeah, I was just curious as to what we define work as, and then how do we balance now work and life, especially with, like you said, you're on call after hours. I mean, work and life, I guess, is just blurred from that
yeah.
perspective, right?
Yeah, you're always reachable. You're always reachable. But I think it has to happen through policies and conversations, right? Let's start with conversations. One, there is not a silver bullet for any of this because people are people, right? And as an IO psychology practitioner yourself, you know if you ever see a study that says 100% of people, then it's a bullshit study. Sorry, it is because that's not how our psychology works. And so we can't be making assumptions. In my study with 8 individuals, what I found was, almost half of them reported, um, too much work being put on their plate, being one of the catalysts toward their eventual passion decline, and almost exactly half of them said the exact opposite, that it wasn't enough. They felt stagnant, like they weren't growing, right? So how do you differentiate? You know your people. One of my favorite things to talk about with employers is this idea that every single one, I don't know, I've never spoken to an employer or manager who hasn't proudly told me that they have an open door policy. And I'm calling BS on that, right? So an open door policy does not mean I sit in my office and tell everyone that I have an open door policy. One step better is to actually have your door open, but that's still not an open door policy. The only open door policy, in my experience, that works is the one where the door is open so that you can get off your butt and walk out there and talk to your employees, right? Don't leave it open and tell them they have to approach you because every employer I know thinks that they're super approachable and it's just not the case. Not everybody is going to feel that safe approaching you or no, or take you up on the offer. So get out there and talk to people and understand what they want from work. That if you have those conversations, you understand whether somebody wants more stretch assignments and wants to take more on, or whether they need to breathe, take some time off, or just have stricter boundaries. The other thing is to, as a rule, right? That's the counterpoint to that is, as a rule, have things built in. Have policies where you don't reach out after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or 7 p.m.
2
Right?
a.m. emails. Yeah.
Yeah, turn off, there are organizations in Europe where they just literally I think it's Volkswagen Group in Germany. They don't have, the when you leave the office, your office stuff turns off, right? But I've worked with Volkswagen Group in America before, and, they don't have that policy. It's a very different sort of thing, but, we have a very different culture for better or for worse sometimes, but yeah, I think having policies in place to protect people and set expectations, I think is incredibly important because if there's anything that I learned from my research, it's that, like Ayala Pine says, um, you know, um, in order to burn out, you need to be on fire first. The people who lose passion for work, um, every one of these people I spoke to, the way they talked about work is the way I talk about my wife on a good day, right? I mean, like they talked about it like it was a love of theirs. And they talked about this like it was a love that they went through this horrible breakup with. And they gave everything for work. And if somebody would have just said, pause, you're taking on too much, that would have been incredibly helpful. It's just like in middle school where we have that friend, or maybe you were that friend who has their first girlfriend or boyfriend and just they go so hot and heavy that the rest of the world stops existing and their friends are now on the like pushed aside and everything is this person and it becomes their whole identity and everything. If you were a good friend, you said, stop. This is healthy because we all saw what happens eventually with that. Right? It burns out and it burns out bad. And that's what happens, I think, with people generally. I say that, if you are going so heavy at work and you don't take a pause, you don't have any balance, you don't protect yourself, then eventually one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to burn out or the world around you is going to burn down.
No, I love that a lot. That's really good. One of the things you said on your website I really like. So all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah.
Can you explain more about that? You kind of touched upon that a little bit, right? That you have to look at people as people. But how do you apply like tactics and strategies with people when you're working with people with burnout?
Yeah, there's a thing with academics, right? And I had this experience which I think it looks from your bio like you did too, although you're certainly not as old as me, but having that work experience, you know, before going back and getting your doctorate and not having your whole life within academia. So it gave me a little bit more of a perspective, but I've spoken with you know, like leadership within large organizations where they have PhDs working for them and stuff, and been told privately that the PhDs actually get the littlest respect, you know, from you know the rank and file leadership, because everything is theoretical, right? And it's like no, we need to deal with what's happening in the real world. So I know when I graduated with my master's that I went out and started dictating, getting these clients and dictating to them. No, the textbook says this, you know, and it's like, what does that have to do with me? So, one of my favorite things that I do with my students at the master's level is we work with real clients, live clients within our classes, and until they get to these classes, they're kind of in. Most of the classes are much more theoretical based and case studies and things like that. But there's more theory, less utility. And so jumping in and saying, okay, I can give the best recommendations ever to this employer, but are they able to implement it? Do they have the people to implement it? Do they have the cash to implement it? Do they have the bandwidth to implement it? And so you have to start really making considerations. And so models are a good place to start. They're a toolkit, right? Where you start. The employer is your partner and the employees within the organization are your partners. They know this better than anybody. And at the within the organization, understanding if you're in leadership that your employees know what's going on better than you in certain aspects. You have the big picture, but they're seeing it and living it daily. To understand that expertise doesn't live in the universities and to understand expertise doesn't live in leadership. Expertise doesn't automatically come with a job title. The more perspectives that are available, the better. And so to work with the individuals and to do things collaboratively to come up with solutions is incredibly important. And of course, that goes right back to the burnout solution where understanding your people and their challenges, they're going to be unique to your organization and they're going to be unique to every individual and the more we can individualize, the better. But I also think that that the models are useful to have sort of blanket starting points.
Love that. So when you go into an organization, what department, I know it kind of depends on different contexts, are you focused on first? Right? It sounds like leadership, you know, what area of the organization do you go and say, "Oh, I need to work on this first to get change initiated?" You kind
Yeah,
of
it's
have that
funny.
as a model?
Yeah, I love HR. I feel like HR and IO are intricately connected, right? And so HR is usually where I enter the organization from, right? Because we have similar goals in mind and we're aligned on thoughts about strategy, right? IO, industrial organizational psychology, and HR are intricately connected. Um, but in terms of the type of work, so my burnout work specifically, I used to be brought in the beginning, and you know, in the beginning, you're hungry and you're learning this business and stuff like that. I used to be brought in as a external consultant and even like as a speaker to speak to the employees. And again, I started learning that the expectation was to teach the employees how to be more resilient. But as I saw this more and more, I saw that they were l leadership had so many opportunities, so many things that they could do. Um, but they just wanted me to teach their employees how to take a punch and get back up, right? And it's like, what if we could work at the leadership level and figure out how to stop throwing punches? Right? What
Or
if,
emails, yeah.
yeah,
Emails
right?
and
Like,
punches, yeah.
what if you're part of their problem and we could fix that? And what if leadership could see their job as almost being sort of like the offensive line, right, for their quarterback, which are these front end employees where their job is to keep these obstacles away from them, to help them not get punched in the face, to support them. Oftentimes, I was working with this nonprofit that I'm a huge believer in it, and they do amazing work. I have this distinct memory of going up to sort of the C-suite, where the CEO and the directors all are, and they are drinking the Kool-Aid, man. They are talking about their mission and vision, and it's not BS. Like they get it. They are so in it. And then they took me for a tour and we went downstairs, and this nonprofit happens to work with people experiencing homelessness. They took me downstairs, and now you have all of these frontline employees who are working directly with a population of people experiencing homelessness. So you're dealing with people with addiction issues, people that are not necessarily incredibly psychologically or mentally well at the time, people who are experiencing incredible levels of stress in their life. And this is my daily. My daily is working directly with these people saying, I want to help you, and them not letting you help them. Right. I just know from my own personal experience, I had a business where there was this one person experiencing homelessness that used to come in all the time. And we started building this relationship. And I finally felt like I could get this person help. And I said, hey, I want to get you help. And so he's like, great. And I called a organization that helps. And he disappeared and I never saw him again ever.
Oh,
So it's like, I want to help you. And then the person you're trying to help is like not open to help,
mm.
and you feel like I'm churning my wheels and not getting anything done, right? There's this disconnect. And then there's this disconnect that I'm working for this organization and because I want to implement change. I want to do this amazing thing. We're working on this great technology. We're whatever it is, and you end up uh involved in so much paperwork and bureaucratic stuff and meeting after meeting after meeting. And it's like, what about the work that I wanted to do? And the irony here is that's the work that your employer wants you to do, right? Our interests actually are aligned as we dig deeper. The stuff that your employees are burning out because they're so much getting in the way of them doing is the stuff that you hired them to do, that you want them to do. So you got to connect the dots for them to see how they're doing it. You have to eliminate all the bureaucracy and interpersonal conflict that gets in the way. And you have to help them continue to see that vision. Um
Find that it's so overlooked today, like the importance of building relationships, like you're talking about, especially in like I work in the manufacturing world and it's, parts every day get shipped out. It's like, how do we get more parts, more parts? And the people make the parts. Yeah, we've got some good things, automation, somewhat, technology to help us, but it's people at the end of the day. I guess, what are your thoughts for like, continually trying to build relations with people. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you mentioned like people drinking the Kool-Aid, right? So it's like they give the hoorah speeches, and then what do you do after, right? I see that a lot, time and time again. Upper management giving these big speeches. We're going to make change. We're going to climb to the top of this mountain, and then it just totally dissipates and fades, and then all the momentum's lost. Like, what do you recommend to keep that going, that momentum for a change
Yeah,
initiative?
it's one of the things that one of the core reasons why change fails, right? One of the core reasons for resistance is because people, especially the more tenured people, are like, "Oh, I saw us go through this exact change, quote unquote."
Flavor of the month.
Right, right, like 5 years ago and nothing happened. Change can be very much a fad. Anything that an organization is working on, it's the shiny object right now, and then but then something else is gonna come up and be prioritized, and it's gonna go away. So I think the relationship building is incredibly important, but also collaborating from the very beginning and getting buy-in and bringing in change agents from all over the organization and being able to take feedback every direction within an organization. I think all these things are incredibly important in order to create change.
So I just want
Um,
to make clear, David, just for our audience here, when you say change agent, what are you referring to?
Yeah, I think I need people who are going to be working on the change from within, right? I need people who are going to be sponsoring the change, but I also need people that are going to be from within. Frontline employees who are part of the design of the change, who are talking to their friends, who are making sure that this thing is not a fad, holding leadership accountable, holding their colleagues accountable. That is incredibly important. I think that when you get into an organization, um, one of the things that I think is often misunderstood is that is sort of like French and Raven are these two researchers who had this seminal work on what influence is and where it comes from within organizations, right? And they talk about influence. One of the sources of power, the sources of influence, is legitimate, right? I am here on the org chart and therefore I have power. And that is a source of power, but it's a very weak source of power. And studies have shown that when you are not in the room, when you're in the room, that power holds up. But when you're not in the room, people will do what they want, right? But there's this other source of power, which is referent power. And referent power does not require a job title. It doesn't even require the ability to punish somebody or reward somebody. But that's a whole other tangent where every employee actually does have the ability to reward and punish each other, and that could be used for good or evil. But referent power is kind of like, this brings us back, but to like the Fonz, right, in Happy Days, like the cool person, the person who is charismatic and everybody wants to be like them. If you are leading or managing within an organization, you better know who holds the power within your organization. I had a client who they were running a summer camp as part of what they do. And they had it out. They butted heads with these two individual counselors. So a counselor in a summer camp, right? With the director of a camp who's part of a much larger organization. These two counselors they had it out with. And so they let the counselors go. Turns out these two counselors had more power than the CEO of this company, and everybody walked out. They had to close down their camp. It was like a week into the summer. They had to close down their camp for the entire summer because they couldn't get anybody to work for them because of that solidarity. It is imperative that you know who actually holds the power within your organization so that you can bring them in and have them on your side as opposed to having them be your opponent.
So you've had experience with working with other companies around the world. So I guess what are your thoughts? What have you seen in terms of the American workplace culture in other countries around the world with respect to that?
I think it's changing and some people are taking on sort of the American value of work all the time, but it is shocking the difference that in America as opposed to other sort of Western countries for sure, that the value that work holds in our life. It is what defines us, right? And it is where we gain our value. And so when you which creates a whole bunch of problems. I think that we see that it creates opportunity because if our whole identity is entangled with work, then you're going to do everything for work, right? But it also creates so many issues where I can't I could take feedback off of things that I'm not feeling are part of my identity. But if it's in my identity, you better not tell me anything about I'm not doing a good job with this, whatever, because now I'm having an identity crisis and I'm feeling crushed. I'm feeling attacked personally, etc. Um, if I'm putting everything in, then I'm going to burn out, and because I lose everything else in my life. Within America, I think there is this unique sense of work is who you are. The first question we ask each other is, "What do you do?"
Oh, I
Yeah,
want to go into this so bad. So,
yeah.
David, please, I've been trying to I talked on a previous episode about how do you answer what do you do? And I don't know how to answer it. I absolutely hate the question. How do you answer it? How do you think it should be answered? I guess why do we even ask it?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question coming from you because looking at your resume, it's like, what do you do? Like
That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I'm
20
just trying to
different
figure out
things, right?
life.
Right, exactly, exactly, and I think that that's really important. The way that you diversify means that you're not going to be overly, um, uh, intertwined with one thing where you're less fragile than a lot of people who are, right? I don't really know how to answer the question, "What do you do?" except don't confuse what you do, and this is a lesson that I learned from one of my, respondents in my study, actually. Don't confuse what you do with who you're doing it for. So the organization you work with, they're not your family, and I will go on a limb and say they could be like family in the sense that you care for each other and you have each other's back, and that's gotta be a mutual thing, obviously, right? And I wish more workplaces would feel like that, and that being like family wouldn't get the eye roll anymore. But I think it's really important that this person's lesson, like the what you do is not who you do it for. And one of the lessons that this individual learned when they lost passion for their work was they have this skill set that they can bring anywhere. Right. And we're moving toward this gig economy anyway, potentially, right? Where it's not going to be all full time employees. It's going to be AI and gig workers,
Yeah,
right?
right,
So
right, right.
can you take what can you package up and take anywhere, right? And do for anyone. So what impact do you have on the world and how do you have it? I think are the two main elements, not what is it that who do you work for, right?
I like that.
Um, I think people identify as teacher, as nurse, as a social worker, and that's okay. But what does it actually mean to you? Like, why? What elements of that? For me, I do the same work whether I'm doing it, in the classroom in a university, or whether I'm doing it from a stage at a conference, or whether I'm doing it in a boardroom with a client. I see what I do as learning everything that I can about the psychology of people and work, and then putting it through my own crazy brain and spitting it out and teaching.
Love it.
I think
Love
learning
it.
and teaching about those things, that's what I do.
I love that.
And to help people make work better for everyone. And so that's kind of what I do. Um, uh, it's not one company or one outlet. And therefore, during the pandemic, when all conferences shut down and I saw so many fellows speakers sort of like panic and not have a business anymore, I'm like, oh, suddenly there's a huge demand for me in consulting.
So, David, if people want to reach out to you, listeners on the show, where do you recommend them to go?
Yeah, so my website, www.davidshar.com. I have another website, illuminatepmc.com. One is geared more toward the consulting, the other more toward the speaking. But really just, continuing the conversation on LinkedIn. You can find me right by my name, David Shar on LinkedIn.
David, thank you so much for taking your time today on the show. We could go on to more and more discussions. Maybe I'll have you
Yeah,
back. I'd love to explore some more, especially IO psychologist. IO psychologist. I love it. But thank you so much for being on the show today.
this has been great. Thank you.
David Shar reminded us that work can and should feel like family, that workers need to protect boundaries like turning off emails after hours, and focusing on quality over quantity in work life balance is essential. That expertise isn't just in leadership or titles, but having more perspectives actually is better. Remember, success is not a matter of good luck, it's good skills. And the skill today is to recognize your boundaries of work and life. Practice keeping work at work and life outside of work outside of work. That isn't to say you can't stop trying to solve a problem, at work, but just not check your emails. I love this one as my calendar really helps me organize all of this so I don't have to worry when I'm doing a particular activity. It's already planned out. And with that, we'll see you next time.